In the early 19th century, one man stood above every king, emperor, and general in Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whose ambition was legendary, whose armies reshaped the continent, whose victories rewrote the maps of the world. By 1812, he had defeated Austria, humbled Prussia, and forced Russia into alliance. He was master of Europe, or so he believed. But he was about to make a decision that would become one of the greatest military catastrophes in human history. Not because of a brilliant enemy, not because of a clever strategy, but because of something far older, far colder, and far deadlier: the Russian winter.
By 1812, Europe was exhausted. Napoleon had spent a decade marching, fighting, and crushing enemy coalitions. The Napoleonic Wars had turned quiet farmland into battlefields and peaceful kingdoms into French satellites. His empire stretched from the mountains of Spain, the plains of Germany, the kingdoms of Italy, to the edge of Poland. He placed his siblings on thrones, installed friendly rulers, controlled economies, enforced laws. But despite his overwhelming power, he had one major problem: Tsar Alexander I of Russia. Originally an ally, the Tsar had grown tired of Napoleon's control, especially the continental system, a massive economic blockade aimed at strangling Britain's trade. Russia's economy was suffering. Russian nobles were angry. The Tsar began quietly rebelling. To Napoleon, this was unacceptable. Disobedience was weakness. Weakness spread. He decided Russia must be punished.
In May 1812, Napoleon assembled an army unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 soldiers. To put that into perspective, more than the population of Paris at the time. More than any European army before the 20th century. A multinational force: French, Polish, Italian, German, Dutch, Swiss, Portuguese, Croats, even Spaniards, forced to fight the empire that occupied their homeland. This wasn't an army. It was a moving civilization. But it also had weaknesses. Many troops were inexperienced conscripts. Many were from warm climates: Italy, Spain, and southern France. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers. Napoleon believed the campaign would be fast. He always believed that. He said famously, "Russia will be a single battle, a thunderbolt." But Russia refused to play by his rules.
On June 24, 1812, Napoleon crossed the Niemen River, declaring, "Russia is crushed." It was the moment Europe held its breath. The Grande Armée marched in perfect formation, drums beating, banners flying, officers rode ahead on fine horses. Soldiers joked, sang, and talked about how soon they'd be home. But Russia was not France. Russia was enormous, empty, vast, silent. By the end of the first week, the problems began. Horses dying, food spoiling, disease spreading. Summer turned the roads to mud, streams dried, wells were empty. But the most shocking thing was this: the Russians simply vanished.
Napoleon expected a grand decisive battle like Austerlitz or Jena. The Russians refused. Instead, General Barclay de Tolly ordered scorched earth, a brutal tactic: villages evacuated, crops burned, livestock slaughtered or moved, storehouses emptied, bridges destroyed, entire cities abandoned. Napoleon's men marched through landscapes of ash. Imagine an army of 600,000 expecting bread, only to find burned wheat fields, blackened orchards, smoking houses, dead wells, not a single edible thing.
Soldiers scavenged like animals. Some ate bark, grass, even candles. The French army still pushed forward, but the Russians kept falling back, deeper, deeper into their own endless land.
After weeks of pursuing a phantom enemy, Napoleon finally reached the fortified city of Smolensk. Here, the Russians stood and fought. Cannons roared, buildings burned, streets ran with blood. Napoleon captured the city, but it was another bitter victory. The Russians retreated. Smolensk was ruined. Supplies were low, and the French had marched 800 kilometers into Russia and achieved nothing decisive. Still, Napoleon believed Moscow would end the war.
Borodino. One of the deadliest single-day battles in human history. 250,000 men engaged, 70,000 casualties, hours of brutal hand-to-hand combat, entire hillsides carpeted with bodies, cannons firing until they melted. At one point, the French suffered 50% casualties in just a few hours. The Russians fought with relentless stubbornness, then, as always, retreated. Napoleon won the battle, but it was a hollow victory. He said quietly, "The most terrible of all my battles, and the most useless."
On September 14, Napoleon entered Moscow, expecting food, shelter, winter supplies, and a peace negotiation. Instead, he saw a nightmare. The city was almost empty. The governor, Rostopchin, had evacuated most citizens. Prisoners were released to cause chaos. And then the fires began. Moscow, one of the greatest cities in Europe, burned for 4 days. Napoleon walked through the ruins in disbelief. No food, no supplies, no surrender, no Tsar. He waited 35 days. Nothing. His army was starving. Winter winds were approaching. Horses were dying. Morale was crumbling. Napoleon finally made the decision he dreaded: retreat.
In mid-October, the French army left Moscow. 2 weeks later, the first blizzard hit. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, then -30 degrees Celsius, sometimes -40 degrees Celsius. It became impossible to march, eat, sleep, hold a weapon, even breathe without pain. Horses froze standing up. Leather hardened. Metal shattered. Wine turned to blocks of ice. Men slept in piles to stay warm. Thousands never woke up. Some journals describe it without flinching. The Grande Armée was no longer an army. It was a broken horde of survivors. Napoleon wrote, "I have seen men fall like flies." This wasn't a retreat. It was a death march. By November, the French reached the Berezina River, only to discover ice too thick for boats, too thin to walk on, bridges destroyed. The Russians closed in. Napoleon ordered his engineers, freezing, starving, but still loyal, to build 2 bridges under enemy fire. It was chaos. Thousands crushed, carts overturned, horses drowned, men pushed into freezing water, artillery abandoned, bodies forming literal dams downstream. Those who fell in the river died in seconds as the ice water ripped the breath from their lungs. But miraculously, Napoleon escaped. The army did not. In December, Napoleon fled Russia and returned to Paris. Behind him, a once great army limped home. Of the 600,000 plus soldiers who had marched into Russia, 100,000 survived. Many horribly wounded, others mentally destroyed, entire regiments erased. This was not a defeat. It was an annihilation. Napoleon himself admitted, "From the sublime to the ridiculous is but a step." The invasion of Russia shattered his empire. It emboldened his enemies. It began the downfall of the greatest commander of his age. All because he underestimated distance, supply challenges, Russian strategy, and winter itself. A winter so fierce it became a character in history, the general who defeated Napoleon.
If you found value in this documentary, consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, and sharing it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe, click the bell, and hit the Height button for more deep dive historical films just like this one.